It started like any other routine flight: boarding passengers, stowing carry-ons, and polite smiles exchanged between strangers crammed into narrow seats. The cabin hummed with a low murmur of voices, the faint whine of the air conditioning, and the occasional clatter of overhead compartments being slammed shut. Amid the usual chaos, one passenger, sharply dressed in a tailored suit, settled into his aisle seat in the middle of the plane. He had an air of quiet confidence, the kind that turned heads without effort. But what no one could have guessed was that this man was a federal agent, a black FBI agent named Marcus Cole, on his way home after an exhausting week on assignment. Marcus wasn't looking for trouble. In fact, he avoided drawing attention to himself wherever possible. Years in the bureau had taught him the value of blending in, of being just another face in the crowd. But his height and build made that difficult. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a steady gaze that carried a weight few could ignore. He'd adjusted his seatbelt, nodded politely to the young woman sitting beside him, and pulled out a book to pass the time. It was just another flight, or so he thought. The flight crew bustled through the aisle, their practiced smiles masking the weariness of yet another day in the sky. One flight attendant, a woman named Heather, was making her rounds with an air of authority that felt out of place in her neatly pressed uniform. She moved briskly, her eyes darting over passengers as though scanning for infractions. Something about her demeanor seemed tense, almost on edge. Heather paused at Marcus' row, her gaze lingering on him a moment too long. He offered her a polite smile, but she didn't return it. Instead, she moved on, her lips pressed into a thin line. A few minutes later, as the plane reached cruising altitude, Marcus was jolted out of his reading by the sound of Heather's voice, sharp and accusatory. "Sir, I need you to place your bag under the seat in front of you," she said, her tone loud enough to draw glances from nearby passengers. Confused, Marcus glanced at his bag, which was already tucked beneath the seat as required. "It's already under the seat," he replied calmly, his voice measured. "Is there a problem?" Heather's eyes narrowed, and her expression hardened. "It's not properly stowed. I need you to do it now." Marcus blinked, surprised by the sudden hostility. "Ma'am, it's secured," he said, leaning down slightly to show her. "Is there an issue?" Instead of de-escalating, Heather's tone sharpened further. "I don't appreciate being argued with," she snapped, her voice rising. "If you don't comply, I'll have to report this as a safety violation." The passengers nearby were starting to pay closer attention, their heads swiveling toward the exchange. Marcus felt the heat of their stares and the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He raised his hands in a gesture of peace, trying to keep his tone calm. "I'm not arguing, ma'am, just trying to clarify." But Heather wasn't having it. She crossed her arms and looked down at him with an air of superiority that made Marcus's stomach twist. "You need to watch your attitude, sir," she said icily. "I don't care who you think you are." The words hit like a slap, loaded with implication. Marcus wasn't sure if it was his size, his race, or something else altogether that had set her off, but the hostility was undeniable. He sat back in his seat, his jaw tightening as he felt the eyes of the cabin on him. He had dealt with people like this before, people who assumed they could talk down to him, that they held some kind of power over him. Normally, he would let it slide, but this time felt different. This time, her tone wasn't just unprofessional, it was personal. Heather stalked off down the aisle, leaving a trail of tension in her wake. Marcus exhaled slowly, trying to shake off the encounter. The young woman next to him leaned over and whispered, "That was weird. Are you okay?" He nodded, forcing a small smile. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said, though the tightness in his chest told a different story. The peace didn't last long. A few minutes later, Heather returned, this time with another crew member in tow. Her voice was sharp and accusatory as she pointed at Marcus. "That's him," she said, refused to comply with instructions and became aggressive. Marcus's heart sank. "What?" he said, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't. I need you to come with us," Heather interrupted, cutting him off. The second flight attendant, clearly uncomfortable, avoided eye contact but stood beside Heather in silent support. Marcus knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but he also knew how these situations could spiral. Years of training had taught him the importance of staying composed, no matter how unfair or absurd the situation. He unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. As he stood, the tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers whispered among themselves, some craning their necks to get a better look. The young woman beside him looked worried, her brow furrowed. "This isn't right," she murmured under her breath. Marcus followed Heather toward the galley, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what her endgame was, but he could feel the situation slipping out of control. She stopped abruptly, spinning around to face him. "Who do you think you are?" she demanded, her voice low but venomous. "You think you can just ignore me and do whatever you want?" Marcus' patience snapped. "Ma'am, I don't know what your problem is," he said, his voice steady but firm, "but I'm not going to let you talk to me like this. I haven't done anything wrong, and you know it." Heather's face twisted in anger. She opened her mouth to reply, but before she could, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge, holding it up so she could see it clearly. "Special Agent Marcus Cole," he said, his tone unwavering. "FBI." The color drained from Heather's face in an instant. Her bravado crumbled as she stared at the badge, her eyes wide with shock. "I didn't realize," she stammered, her voice faltering. Marcus lowered the badge slowly, his gaze steady. "Now, you want to explain what this is really about?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an edge that left no room for argument. Heather's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The passengers who had been watching the scene unfold seemed to hold their breath, the silence in the cabin stretching like a taut wire. Whatever power Heather thought she had, it had vanished in an instant, leaving her scrambling for a way to save face. And that was when the begging began. Heather's lips quivered, but no coherent words escaped. Her earlier sharpness, her confidence, everything about her demeanor had evaporated. Marcus held her gaze, his expression calm yet unyielding. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he also wasn't about to let himself be the target of baseless accusations. The passengers nearby were still staring, their whispers now louder, a hum of curiosity and judgment filling the air. "I didn't mean to," Heather began, her voice trembling, but Marcus cut her off with a quiet but firm tone. "Let me make something clear," he said. "I don't care about your terminal or your bad day. What I care about is you treating me like I'm a problem when I've done nothing wrong. If there's a legitimate issue, let's handle it. But this, whatever this is, it stops now." Heather's face burned red as she danced around, her embarrassment growing with every second. The second flight attendant, a younger man who looked deeply uncomfortable with the whole scene, cleared his throat softly. "Heather," he said under his breath, "maybe we should, step back and reevaluate." She shot him a look that could frozen an engine mid-flight, but it was clear the damage was done. Whatever control Heather thought she had over the situation had slipped completely through her fingers, and everyone, including her fellow crew members, knew it. Marcus, still standing in the galley, felt the familiar pull of exhaustion. Not just from the flight or Heather's unwarranted hostility, but from the weight of a lifetime spent navigating moments like this. He didn't wear a chip on his shoulder. He worked hard to avoid letting resentment take root. But he wasn't blind either. He knew how people saw him sometimes, his size, his skin, his presence, and how quickly assumptions could turn into accusations. The silence was broken by the young woman who had been sitting next to Marcus. She had followed him toward the galley, her voice clear and steady as she addressed Heather. "Excuse me, but I don't think he did anything wrong," she said. "I saw the whole thing. His bag was stowed properly, and he was polite the entire time. You're the one who escalated this." Heather's jaw tightened, her frustration now tinged with panic. "Ma'am, I don't believe this involves you," she snapped. The young woman didn't flinch. "It does when I'm sitting next to someone who's being treated unfairly," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. "You can't just target people and expect no one to notice." Heather's glare faltered, her eyes darting to the growing number of passengers who were leaning into the conversation. The murmurs in the cabin had taken on a sharper edge, and was clear the tide was turning against her. Marcus held up a hand, addressing the woman beside him. "Thank you," he said, his tone genuine, "but I can handle this." Turning his attention back to Heather, he spoke with quiet authority. "Now, unless you have an actual safety concern or something else to explain your behavior, I'd like to return to my seat. If you still think there's a problem, you're welcome to escalate this to the airline, but I'm done standing here being accused of things I didn't do." Heather hesitated, her mouth opening as though to protest, but no words came. Finally, she stepped aside, gesturing stiffly for Marcus to return to his seat. "Fine," she muttered, "but I'll be writing a report about this." Marcus didn't reply. He simply nodded and made his way back down the aisle, his footsteps measured and deliberate. The tension in the cabin seemed to follow him, like an invisible wave rolling through the rows of seats. As he sat down, the young woman beside him gave him an encouraging smile. "Good for you," she said softly. "That was a lot." Marcus exhaled, nodding. "More than it needed to be," he replied. "Thank you for speaking up back there." She shrugged, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's the least I could do. I can't stand seeing people get mistreated like that." Before Marcus could respond, the overhead speaker crackled, and the pilot's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're cruising at an altitude of 35,000 feet, and we'll be arriving at our destination on schedule. For now, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the rest of your flight." The captain's voice carried a layer of calm professionalism, but it wasn't enough to completely dispel the lingering unease in the cabin. Marcus leaned back in his seat, trying to let the moment pass. He wasn't angry, not exactly. He was used to moments like this, to having to prove himself in ways that others never seemed to need to. But the weariness, the constant, quiet drain, it was there, just below the surface. He glanced down at his book, trying to refocus, but his mind kept circling back to Heather. Something about her hostility had felt personal, deliberate. It wasn't just a bad day or a misunderstanding. There had been an edge to her behavior that didn't sit right with him. And then there was the look on her face when she saw his badge. The sudden shift, the panic, it was more than just embarrassment. It was fear. The young woman next to him interrupted his thoughts. "Do you fly a lot?" she asked, clearly trying to lighten the mood. Marcus nodded, offering a faint smile. "Comes with the job," he said. "Traveling's a big part of what I do." "What kind of work are you in?" she asked. He hesitated for a moment before replying. "Law enforcement," he said simply. He wasn't in the habit of broadcasting his FBI status, especially not in situations like this. Her eyebrows raised slightly, and she nodded, as if that explained everything. "Well, you handled that a lot better than I would have," she said. "I probably would have lost it back there." Marcus chuckled softly, though there was little humor in it. "Years of practice," he said. "You learn to pick your battles." The conversation trailed off, and Marcus turned his attention back to the book in his hands. But even as he read, his instincts hummed in the background. Something about the situation felt unfinished, like an itch he couldn't quite scratch. Heather's reaction hadn't just been about him. He was certain of it now. There was something more, something she wasn't saying. And that's when he noticed it. Heather, standing at the front of the cabin near the galley, whispering urgently to another flight attendant. Her movements were stiff, her gestures sharp, and she kept glancing over her shoulder toward Marcus. Whatever she was saying, it wasn't good. Marcus' jaw tightened as he watched her, his mind racing. Was she planning to escalate things further? Report him to the captain, or worse, try to get law enforcement involved when they landed? His badge might have stopped her in a moment, but that didn't mean she was done. And if there was one thing Marcus had learned over the years, it was to never underestimate someone who felt cornered. For now, though, he stayed in his seat, his expression calm, his demeanor steady. He didn't want to make a scene, but he wasn't going to let his guard down either. Whatever Heather was planning, he'd be ready for it. Heather's whispers at the front of the plane didn't go unnoticed, and neither did the way her eyes kept darting in Marcus's direction. Her gestures were quick and agitated, the kind you'd expect from someone trying to rally support for something they weren't entirely sure of themselves. Marcus kept his expression neutral, but inside, his instincts were firing on all cylinders. Whatever Heather was up to, she wasn't letting this go. The young woman next to him, her name was Vanessa, as she introduced herself a few minutes earlier, noticed his tension. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "She's still watching you," she murmured. "What's her deal?" Marcus shook his head subtly. "I wish I knew," he replied, "but it's not over. That's for sure." Vanessa glanced toward the front of the cabin, her brow furrowing. "You think she's going to try something else?" Marcus exhaled slowly, considering his words. "People don't double down like that unless they think they have something to prove," he said. "She's either trying to cover her tracks or justify her behavior, but whatever it is, it's not good." Vanessa didn't seem convinced by his calm tone. "Shouldn't you, reporter? Tell the captain what's going on." Marcus gave her a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm not trying to escalate things unless I have to," he said. "Let's see what she does first." The minutes dragged on, and the tension in the cabin seemed to thicken like fog. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, stealing glances at Marcus and then at Heather. It wasn't just a small misunderstanding anymore. It was the kind of scene that stuck in people's minds, the kind they'd bring up later when recounting the strange events of their flight. At the front, Heather finally broke away from the other flight attendant and disappeared through the curtains separating the galley from the rest of the cabin. Marcus noticed the man she'd been speaking to, a junior crew member by the look of him, hesitate for a moment before walking down the aisle. His movements were nervous, as though he didn't fully agree with what he'd been asked to do. He stopped near Marcus' row, his eyes scanning the seat numbers. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Marcus looked up, keeping his expression neutral. "What's this about?" he asked. The crew member hesitated, glancing around as if searching for the right words. "It's, just a quick follow-up about earlier. Could you come with me to the galley?" Vanessa immediately bristled beside Marcus. "He's already explained himself," she said, her tone sharper than before. "Why does he need to go anywhere?" The crew member looked uncomfortable, holding up a placating hand. "I understand, ma'am, but it's standard protocol to clarify any issues. It won't take long." Marcus sighed, unbuckling his seatbelt. "It's fine," he said, giving Vanessa a reassuring glance. "I'll handle it." As he stood, Vanessa gave him a look that said she wasn't entirely convinced. "I'll be right here," she said firmly. Marcus nodded and followed the crew member back to the galley. The curtain swung closed behind them, muffling the sounds of the cabin. Heather was there, standing with her arms crossed and an expression that was equal parts smug and defensive. Her body language screamed someone gearing up for a fight, but there was also a flicker of nervousness in her eyes, as if she hadn't fully thought through her plan. "Sir," Heather began, her tone clipped, "I've spoken with the rest of the crew, and we have some concerns about your behavior on this flight." Marcus raised an eyebrow, keeping his expression neutral. "Concerns," he repeated. "Care to elaborate?" Heather straightened her posture, as if trying to reassert control. "You've been uncooperative and argumentative, and that's a safety issue," she said. "I need to ensure that all passengers are compliant for the safety of everyone on board." Marcus met her gaze evenly, his voice calm but firm. "I wasn't uncooperative. I complied with every instruction you gave me, despite the fact that you were hostile from the start. If anyone's creating an issue, it's not me." Heather's face reddened slightly, but she pressed on. "Regardless, I have the authority to address any behavior that I believe poses a threat to the flight. If necessary, I'll involve the captain." There it was, the threat she'd been working up to. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he didn't let it show. He'd seen this play out before in different forms and contexts. People who felt their authority slipping often resorted to threats as a last-ditch effort to reassert control. But this wasn't just about her authority, it was about something deeper, something personal. "You're welcome to involve the captain," Marcus said evenly. "In fact, I prefer it. If we're going to address this, let's make sure we do it transparently." Heather blinked, caught off guard by his response. She opened her mouth to reply, but before she could, the curtain behind Marcus rustled. The junior crew member, who had been lingering awkwardly near the coffee machine, suddenly stepped forward. "Actually," he said, his voice tentative but clear, "I think we should hold off on involving the captain for now. Maybe we can resolve this another way." Heather shot him a glare, but he didn't back down. He looked at Marcus, then back at her. "I don't think there's enough here to justify escalating things further," he said carefully. "We've got a full cabin, and we don't want to disrupt the passengers any more than we already have." Heather's lips thinned, her frustration evident, but she didn't argue. Marcus, for his part, felt a flicker of respect for the younger crew member. He was clearly stuck in a difficult position, but he was trying to steer things toward a more reasonable outcome. After a tense pause, Heather exhaled sharply. "Fine," she said, her tone clipped. "But I'm still documenting this for the record." Marcus nodded, his expression calm. "Do whatever you need to do," he said. "I'll be in my seat." He turned and walked out of the galley, the weight of the exchange still heavy on his shoulders. As he returned to his row, he noticed Vanessa watching him closely, her concern evident. "Everything okay?" she asked as he sat down. Marcus gave her a faint smile. "For now," he said, "but something tells me this isn't over." Vanessa frowned, glancing toward the front of the cabin. "She's really pushing this, isn't she? What's her problem?" Marcus shook his head, his voice quiet. "I wish I knew, but people like that, they don't usually stop until they feel like they've won." The rest of the flight passed in a strange, tense silence. Heather stayed out of sight for the most part, but Marcus could feel the occasional flicker of her gaze from the front of the cabin. It was the kind of tension that lingered long after the initial conflict, leaving a sour taste in the air. As the plane began its descent, Marcus's mind was already racing through the possibilities. Heather's behavior wasn't just unprofessional, it was personal targeted, and if she was willing to go this far, there was no telling what she might try next. For now, though, he kept his focus steady, his instincts sharp. Whatever happened when they landed, he'd be ready for it.